There are nights when the sea murmurs in forgotten tongues, when the tide seems to whisper the syllables of a vanished name, Atlantis. Beneath the dark velvet of the ocean, memory drifts like shattered marble, like temple walls dreaming in silence. Sailors once said the waves were haunted by the breath of drowned gods. Philosophers believed a great city had fallen into the depths as punishment for pride. Yet time, that great devourer, could not wholly erase it. The myth endured in the eyes of prophets, in the ink of ancient scrolls, in the hush between Plato's words. Atlantis became more than a city. It became a question, a mirror for the soul of humanity, what we build, what we destroy, and what the sea remembers when we are gone. Listen now as we journey through memory and ruin, through myth and revelation, through the shining gates of an empire that claimed to rival heaven itself. The story of Atlantis is not only a tale of stone and water, it is a reflection of us, of the civilizations we build from ambition and dissolve through arrogance. Somewhere between truth and dream, it still breathes. Tonight, we descend to find it. If the story of the sea's lost kingdom stirs something within you, stay, drift with us into the ancient silence. Listen to the song of the deep as we uncover what remains of Atlantis, not in maps or myths, but in the memory of the world itself. The night is heavy with the breath of the sea. It stretches into eternity, black and breathing, as though the whole world were caught in the lungs of something vast and sleeping. The waves rise and fall like ancient hearts, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear their pulse, the rhythm of ages, of kingdoms that have come and gone, of names once spoken and then swallowed whole. Somewhere in that murmur lies a secret that the world has tried to remember since time began. The secret of Atlantis. It was never just a story. It was a remembrance passed from the tongues of priests to poets, from temples to manuscripts, until it reached the philosopher Plato, who alone dared to fix it in words. He claimed it was no invention, but a transmission of memory, a tale preserved by the Egyptian priests of Sais and brought to Greece by Solon, one of Athens' wisest men. In their language, Atlantis was a warning written in water, a reflection of what happens when power forgets reverence. Yet before it was a moral tale, it was something real, or at least it felt real, the way a dream can feel more vivid than waking life. Imagine then the world before the flood, a vast blue planet scattered with islands, continents half drowned and half rising. The earth still trembled from its making. Volcanoes pulsed like wounds in the sea's surface. Great rivers carved their stories into stone. In that dawn of civilization, the Atlantic was not the silent expanse we know, but a cradle of storm and sunlight, where landmasses shifted like drifting thoughts in the mind of the divine. It was here, at the threshold between chaos and creation, that the city of Atlantis was said to have stood, radiant, geometrically perfect, built upon concentric rings of land and water that glimmered like the eye of a god staring upward through the sea. Plato spoke of it not as a myth, but as a record. The priests of Sais had told Solon that 9,000 years before his time, Atlantis had waged war upon the world. From its golden plains and silver citadels, its kings commanded fleets that could encircle nations, its temples blazed with the light of molten orichalcum, and its gardens bloomed with fruits unknown to mortal soil. They were not merely men, these Atlanteans, they were the children of gods. They remembered their divine origin, and in remembering, they believed themselves immortal. Yet even immortality can corrode. In the silence of the deep, pride is the first sound that fades. The Atlanteans had been gifted harmony, 10 kings ruling in justice under the law of Poseidon, but time bends all perfection toward decay. They began to hunger for conquest, for dominion beyond their shining shores. The sea, which had once been their mirror, became their weapon, and so began the story that would end in silence. The philosophers who later pondered Atlantis argued over its truth. Some believed it a political allegory, Plato's warning against the arrogance of empire, written as Greece began to rise toward its own hubris. Others believed it a symbolic geography, a spiritual landscape describing the fall of humanity from divine order into chaos. But beneath the interpretation lies the pulse of something older, something that the ancients themselves seem to remember in their bones: a flood, a loss, a great world erased. Across civilizations, that memory repeats. In Mesopotamia, the god Enlil sent the deluge to cleanse a corrupted race. In the Hebrew scriptures, Noah built an ark to survive the same. In the epics of India, Manu received warning from the fish god. In each tale, the sea is both destroyer and preserver, swallowing one world to birth another. Could it be that Atlantis was simply one version of this eternal rhythm? Or was it the first, the primal drowning that all later myths echo, each a faint reflection of the same deep memory? Archaeologists, cautious and reverent in their skepticism, have searched for evidence: the ruins off Bimini, the structures of Santorini, the sunken stones near the Azores. Each discovery stirs the same question: are these the remnants of Atlantis or merely the earth-shifting bones? The truth hides in the tension between the two. For Atlantis, whether myth or memory, holds power not because it can be found, but because it cannot be forgotten. It is the dream of humanity's first fall, the awareness that paradise, once known, can never be reclaimed, only remembered in the rhythm of the waves. And so the story begins not with discovery, but with remembrance. The ancients did not think of history as we do, a sequence of dates and proofs, but as the echo of divine cycles. They believed the past could return if the heart was still enough to hear it. Perhaps that is why Atlantis haunts us, because in some quiet place within, we still remember what it felt like to live in harmony with the divine, before the sea rose, before the world began again. The philosophers called it an island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the narrow strait we now know as Gibraltar. Beyond it lay the great outer ocean, the boundary between the known and the eternal. To cross, it was to trespass into the realm of the gods. Yet the Atlanteans had no fear. They built ships of astonishing craft, sails like white wings cutting across the foam. They mapped the stars, learned the speech of the winds, and built ports where none should have been. Theirs was a civilization of mastery, of nature, of art, of spirit. And yet, beneath that brilliance, there was a slow forgetting. Plato wrote that when the divine portion in them faded and human nature took its place, they became unable to bear their prosperity with moderation. The harmony that had sustained them fractured into ambition. Their city, once radiant with the order of the heavens, began to echo the corruption of the earth. It was then, he said, that Zeus gathered the gods and spoke, "Behold, the race once divine, now sunk in darkness. Let the balance be restored." And the sea obeyed. But before that night, there was a golden age, and that is where we must wander next, for no ruin can be understood without first beholding its glory. In the quiet that follows creation, the world was still young, and memory had the texture of light. The oceans shimmered with the breath of the gods, and the lands that would one day fracture into continents lay fused beneath the sun's newborn gaze. It was here, say the legends, that Poseidon descended, his trident carving paths through the sea, his eyes mirroring the horizon's fire. He found upon a small hill, rising from the salt and wind, a mortal woman named Cleito. Her spirit was bright and untamed, her heart the reflection of the island itself, strong, fertile, wild. And the god, moved by her mortal beauty, encircled her hill with rings of water, one of land, one of sea, and another of land again, until she was forever bound within a fortress of divine geometry. From their union were born 10 sons, the first kings of Atlantis. Each inherited a fragment of Poseidon's strength, a measure of his divine temper. To Atlas, the eldest, Poseidon gave dominion over the central hill, and from his name the island took its own, Atlantis, the Isle of Atlas. Around him, his brothers ruled 10 regions, governed by laws inscribed in orichalcum, the metal that gleamed like red fire beneath the sun. And upon that hill, within concentric walls of gleaming white, red, and black stone, stood the temple of Poseidon, its roof sheathed in silver, its pillars bathed in the blood-red glow of copper and fire. The city was alive with sound, fountains murmuring from carved lions' mouths, chariots clattering upon polished stone, voices rising in songs that praised the sea's eternal father. There were docks so vast that 1,000 ships could anchor side by side, their prows carved into the shapes of sea beasts, their sails painted with the signs of the constellations. The streets, wide and measured, were lined with houses built of coral and ivory, their gardens overflowing with fruit and flowers unknown to the lands beyond. The air itself shimmered with the scent of salt and myrrh. Yet beyond beauty, there was order, an order said to mirror the structure of the heavens. The kings met every 5th and 6th year, alternating their assemblies according to celestial rhythm. They hunted together, sacrificed to Poseidon, and judged the disputes of men in the great temple's sacred court. There, upon a pillar of shining metal, were written the ancient laws, that no king should wage war upon another, that all should protect the island's harmony, that none should forget the blood of their divine father. Beneath those laws, the priestly scribes inscribed symbols of the sea, spirals, waves, and tridents, a language older than any alphabet known to man. To the Atlanteans, the sea was not a boundary but a bridge. Their fleets reached the edges of the earth, to Egypt, to Libya, to the lands beyond the western horizon. They traded in gold, tin, and amber. They built lighthouses that shone across the night like small suns. They charted the stars not only for navigation, but for prophecy, believing the heavens were the ocean's reflection, each constellation a sign of divine thought. In their schools, philosophy and astronomy were taught beside shipbuilding and metallurgy. To be Atlantean was to master both the world and the spirit, to find balance between matter and mystery. But there was a shadow beneath the brilliance. Power like the tide has its pull. The kings began to envy Atlas, whose portion was richest in metal and field. His brothers, once content to govern their provinces in peace, began to covet the central power that radiated from the Golden City. Some whispered that Poseidon's blood was fatting from their veins. Others said that the god himself, having turned his gaze back to the sea, no longer watched his sons with favor. Whatever the cause, a restlessness grew. The laws that once held them in unity began to crack like marble under the weight of time. In the archives of Sais, the Egyptian priests told Solon that Atlantis had become the mightiest power upon earth, its empire extending as far as the shores of Italy and Egypt, its armies sweeping across continents like waves. They claimed the Atlanteans sought to enslave all who stood before them, driven by a desire not for survival, but for dominion. Only Athens, young and small, resisted their conquest. The gods, watching from their celestial thrones, saw the balance of the world tilt toward corruption, and so they decreed the end. But in that final twilight before ruin, the city shone as no other. There were towers so tall they touched the clouds, gardens that glowed with the reflection of the moon, and altars where the priests sang hymns older than language. The people believed their prosperity eternal. They did not see how the ground beneath their feet trembled with forewarning, how the sea had begun to whisper not praise, but hunger. The deep, it seemed, was remembering. Still in this moment, before the fall, before the flood, Atlantis was paradise made manifest. It was the dream of divine order given form, a civilization so perfect that even time seemed reluctant to move forward. And perhaps that is why it had to end. For nothing born of gods can remain untouched by the will of the divine. The island was a mirror of heaven. So said the scribes of old, that the city of Atlantis was built not merely as a dwelling, but as an imitation of the divine order. Each ring of land and sea represented a harmony between the elements, earth encircled by water, water encircled by sky, sky reflecting fire. The very geometry of the city was a prayer, a living hymn to the cosmos. From the central temple of Poseidon, sacred avenues radiated outward, aligning with the stars of the equinox, each gate opening to a cardinal wind. The architects of Atlantis were not simply builders, they were interpreters of creation itself, shaping matter to echo the breath of God. And yet the perfection they built became a kind of prison, for when man recreates paradise, he also begins to desire its control. The Atlanteans studied the mysteries of the sea until they mastered tides, currents, and storms. They learned to harness the power of the earth's fire, channeling it through underground forges that roared like dragons beneath the city. Some accounts from later mystics and lost tablets whisper that they discovered energies unknown to us, the vibration of the very ether, the hidden harmony that could raise stone without hand, light flame without fuel. Whether truth or myth, it was said that the sound of their temples could make mountains tremble. But such mastery demanded a price. To control the natural order is to stand on the edge of divine law. The priests warned of this, that Poseidon's favor was not a gift but a covenant, and every act of dominion was a test of balance. Yet power blinds even the wise. Soon, their temples became less a place of worship and more a theater of invention. Offerings grew fewer. Festivals of gratitude turned into celebrations of conquest. The 10 kings, once bound by sacred oath, began to contest one another's wealth and dominion. The divine tongue faded from their rituals, replaced by the language of decree, and in the silence that followed, the sea began to stir. The elders of Sais, who told this tale to Solon, said the world beyond Atlantis trembled before its power. Armies of bronze and iron marched under its banners, their armor gleaming like sunlight on the sea. From their harbors, fleets spread like wings, reaching Egypt, Tyrrhenia, and the pillars of Heracles. They enslaved nations, toppled temples, and brought tribute of gold, elephants, and incense. But among their conquests arose a small and defiant city, Athens, whose virtue, said the priests, was pure enough to resist them. In this detail, Plato saw a mirror of his own people, the humble defeating the proud, the virtuous triumphing over the mighty. Yet even this, perhaps, was but a shadow of something older, the endless rhythm of rise and fall that governs all empires. Still, the Atlanteans did not see their decline. To them, the tremors that shook their land were not omens, but inconveniences. The clouds that darkened their horizon were dismissed as passing storms. The gods, they thought, were distant, their power was their own. The priests who warned of imbalance were silenced or forgotten, their prophecies buried beneath festivals of triumph. And as pride ascended, the sound of the sea deepened, a slow, relentless heartbeat in the dark, reminding the world that it was not yet done with its creation. In the last days before the fall, Atlantis was a vision of divine contradiction. Its streets were bright with gold, yet heavy with foreboding. The waters in its channels reflected both moonlight and shadow. Fishermen spoke of strange tides, of stars shifting their place, of the sea's floor rumbling like distant thunder. In the royal temple, the high priests claimed to hear a voice rising from the depths, the voice of Poseidon himself, silent for generations, now murmuring again in anger. And then there was the night. It began with a wind that no sailor could read. It rose without storm, without cloud, carrying the scent of salt and fire. The moon vanished behind a veil of trembling vapor. From the western horizon came a sound, not thunder, not wave, but something older, the cracking of the world's foundation. The earth opened. The temples shuddered. Towers fell in silence before the sound reached them. The concentric canals of Atlantis burst inward, their waters devouring the lower rings of the city. The sea, as though remembering its ancient dominion, returned to claim its own. In a single night, as Plato wrote, Atlantis sank beneath the waves. The shining city, once a mirror of the gods, vanished like breath on glass. Only the sea remained still, endless knowing. But the memory of it did not die. It passed into the dreams of humanity, into the myths of every land that ever feared the ocean's hunger. For even as it drowned, Atlantis became eternal. Its fall was not an ending, but a reflection, a whisper that all greatness carries within it the seed of its undoing, and that even the deepest ruin can become the world's most beautiful dream. And so the sea kept its secret. Beneath its shimmering veil lay the bones of temples, the shadows of streets, the ghosts of kings. The deep, like memory, forgets nothing. The waves remember the gods. Long after men have forgotten their names, the sea still hums with the sound of their breath. In its depths, there are echoes of creation, the memory of when divinity touched the world and left its image behind. So it was with Poseidon, the earth shaker, the lord of the deep, the one who crowned mountains and carved trenches with the strike of his trident. To the Atlanteans, he was not a distant god, but the father of their blood, the architect of their island, and the guardian of their fate. In the beginning, the story says, Poseidon found Cleito upon a hill that rose from the middle of the island. She was alone, orphaned by the first fires of the earth. The god watched her with a kind of reverence, not the desire of mortals, but the divine curiosity that compels creation itself. He loved her, not for beauty alone, but because she represented the perfect balance of spirit and earth, the pulse of life that had learned to endure the chaos of the sea. To protect her, Poseidon encircled her hill with walls of water and land, 5 in number, each separated by rings of the sea that he himself had summoned from the deep. Thus was born the shape of Atlantis, the city of circles, reflecting both eternity and divine order. From this union came 10 sons, and in them Poseidon divided his divine power as a man divides light through crystal. Atlas, the eldest, was given the heart of the island and the crown of kingship. His brothers were assigned their dominions: Eumelus, Amphas, Evaemon, Nesius, Autochthon, Elasippus, Mestor, Aziz, and Diapreps. Each ruled a region, and together they formed the 10 thrones of Atlantis. In their youth they lived as brothers, united by the sacred laws of their father. They governed wisely, judged fairly, and built their cities in the pattern of the heavens. The Atlantean Empire, born from the sea, grew not through war, but through balance. Atlas was said to have been the most divine among them. His spirit was calm and vast, like the ocean itself. The priests told that his gaze could calm storms, that when he raised his hand, the tide obeyed. It was from him that the island took its name, Atlantis, the realm of Atlas. His temple stood at the center of the sacred ring, a masterpiece of both power and beauty. Its walls gleamed with orichalcum, that legendary red-gold metal, more radiant than copper, more sacred than gold. Inside the temple stood a statue of Poseidon driving 6 winged horses, his sons surrounding him like stars around a sun. Every surface reflected light, marble, gold, and crystal, blending into a brilliance that seemed to shimmer between earth and heaven. The sons of Poseidon built their kingdom upon 3 sacred principles: order, reverence, and remembrance. Order governed their laws, for they believed every action should mirror the harmony of the cosmos. Reverence guided their worship, not fear, but the awe of beings who saw the divine reflected in the sea, in the wind, in the rhythm of creation. And remembrance, that was their soul. They remembered that they were not gods, though they carried divine blood. They were caretakers of their father's gift, stewards of a world entrusted to their balance. But as the centuries passed, the pulse of that memory began to fade. The sons of Poseidon became kings, and their children, though noble, were born of both divine and mortal blood. With each generation, the god's essence grew thinner, and human nature rose in its place. The priests began to notice the change first. Their prayers grew quieter, their visions dimmer. The omens that once spoke clearly from the sea became clouded, uncertain, and in that silence, ambition began to stir. Atlas's descendants, ruling from the central capital, began to believe themselves the rightful rulers of all the island. They saw their father's temple not as a shrine of unity, but as a throne of conquest. They remembered Poseidon's dominion over the oceans and took it as their own inheritance. The others resisted, and so the balance began to tremble. Still, for many ages, Atlantis remained radiant. Its fields yielded twice the harvest of other lands. The herds of sacred bulls roamed freely through emerald meadows. The people worshipped in song and silence, believing their city to be eternal. Travelers spoke of its harbors, vast, circular, glimmering with light, where merchants from every known world came to trade. The sound of the sea blended with music from lyres of silver and drums carved from ivory. There was peace, there was knowledge, and there was the unshaken faith that Atlantis stood at the center of the world. But perfection has a strange gravity. It draws pride as naturally as it draws reverence. In the libraries of Atlantis, scholars debated the mysteries of the divine, not to understand them, but to master them. They sought to measure eternity, to calculate the breath of the gods, Temples that had once been filled with prayers now echoed with the voices of men seeking to rival their creator. The sea, which had once mirrored their harmony, began to darken. It is said that Poseidon withdrew his presence then. The waves grew colder, the winds more unpredictable. Earthquakes shook the southern mountains, and strange lights flickered beneath the ocean at night. The priests cried out that the covenant had been broken, that the sons of Poseidon had forgotten their father's command, to rule with balance, to remember their origin. But the kings no longer listened. They looked upon their wealth, their fleets, their empire that stretched beyond sight, and they said, "We are the gods now." And so the silence began, the divine silence that comes before every fall. The sons of Poseidon, once united, now became rivals. Their temples glowed with gold but lacked prayer. Their palaces stood tall, but their foundations were hollow. The sea, patient and watchful, waited for the moment when pride would tip the scales of fate. And in the heart of that silence, a whisper rose from the deep, a tremor, soft and distant, like the first breath of a storm. Night upon the sea was not dark in Atlantis. It glowed with quiet fire. The harbors shone from 1,000 lamps reflected in the water, each flicker rippling across the surface like a whisper of the gods. From the hills, the marble palaces glimmered like constellations brought down to earth. In that radiance, the sons of Poseidon held their council, clothed in robes dyed with the blue of crushed lapis and threaded with gold. Around them, the walls of their chambers were etched with the histories of their bloodline, scenes of their father raising the island from the deep, of Plato crowned with coral, of the first covenant between divine and mortal. But though the images still spoke of harmony, the hearts of those who looked upon them began to stir with quiet unrest. Atlas the eldest was the most silent among them. He had inherited not only his father's strength but his solitude. The younger kings sought his counsel often, but fewer now obeyed it. Aziz and Diapreps, whose lands bordered the outer ring, began to dream of power beyond the sea. They spoke of fleets to cross the pillars of Heracles, of kingdoms to conquer beyond the dawn. To them, the sea no longer represented balance, but horizon, something to be claimed, not revered. The priests of Poseidon watched the change and grew fearful. They said the sons of the god were forgetting their covenant. The temple bells that once sang at dawn and dusk now rang unevenly, their tones distorted by the storms that gathered without reason. Fishermen whispered of strange movements beneath the waves, great shapes that glowed and vanished, as though the sea itself were restless. The air had grown heavy, not with storm, but with something unspoken, the waiting breath of consequence. Among the people, stories spread that the blood of Poseidon was fading. Children no longer bore the pale eyes of their divine ancestors. The healing rites that once cured any sickness began to fail. Even the sacred bulls, those white creatures whose blood sealed the king's oaths, began to vanish from the fields. To some, these were signs of neglect, to others, punishment. Yet the kings ignored such omens. Their attention had turned to war. Atlas alone resisted. He called his brothers to council and spoke of the old law that Atlantis was not meant to conquer, but to preserve. He reminded them that Poseidon had created the island as sanctuary, not empire. "We are of the sea," he said, "and the sea serves none who command it." But his words fell into silence. Around him, the chamber grew cold. The other kings exchanged glances that shimmered like drawn blades. "You speak as a priest," said Diapreps. "But the gods are silent. It is we who shape the world now." And so, the last shadow fell between them. The fleets of Atlantis, once devoted to exploration and trade, became instruments of conquest. Armies clad in orichalcum marched beneath banners woven with the symbol of the trident. Cities beyond the sea were offered peace, and when they refused, they were swallowed. The Atlanteans built colonies on distant shores, fortresses along coasts that had never known their name. The ocean became a path of fire, each wave carrying both wealth and warning. But the greater their dominion grew, the more their hearts turned from the sea. The priests withdrew to the temples, praying that Poseidon would yet forgive his children. They burned incense that no longer rose straight, its smoke curling and falling as if pushed down by unseen hands. The storms that once came with rhythm now broke without pattern. Earth trembled beneath the capital. A great fissure opened in the northern mountains, spewing ash that glowed red in the night. Still, the kings refused to yield. They called it the Earth's jealousy, not its judgment. One night, as the story is told in fragments across time, Atlas stood upon the steps of the Temple of Poseidon and watched lightning strike across the horizon. It split the sky into shards of white and indigo. The waves below rose higher than they ever had, crashing against the sea walls until the stones themselves seemed to bleed. He felt the pulse of the deep, that ancient rhythm that had birthed their island, and he knew the covenant was broken. He descended into the inner sanctum, where the statue of Poseidon loomed in silence. Beneath its bronze gaze burned a single lamp of sacred oil, its flame flickering like the last breath of the divine. Atlas knelt and spoke, not as king but as son. "Father," he said, "forgive us. We have taken your gift and made it our crown." But there was no answer, only the sound of the waves pressing against the walls, steady, relentless, eternal. The priests would later say that this was the final moment when Atlantis might have been saved, the instant before the balance tipped, when humility could still have silenced pride. But the prayer of one could not undo the will of 10. And so the silence deepened. The storms became voices, the earth began to shake. The light of Atlantis, once steady as the moon, now flickered like a candle in wind. The kings gathered once more, not in unity but in fear. Their temples trembled, their ships tore at their moorings. Somewhere in the chaos, the people began to remember the old stories, that no kingdom born of gods could stand against the will of heaven forever. In that realization, something ancient stirred, a whisper that had been waiting in the dark since the first wave touched the shore. The sea was calling its children home. In the final years before the fall, Atlantis stood between two heartbeats, one divine, one mortal. The sea around it darkened to a shade the poets would later call the sorrow of Poseidon, though the people, still cloaked in their wealth, could not see the warning. The air grew heavy with the scent of salt and ash. The priests said the ocean was remembering its command, that the god who once encircled their island in protection was now drawing near again, not as guardian, but as judge. Still, the kings continued their rule. They held their festivals beneath the light of burning torches, their banquets overflowing with fruits from distant lands, their songs echoing over the waters. The temples of the outer rings burned with the red light of orichalcum, casting the faces of the people in molten glow. To the weary and the wise, it looked less like gold and more like fire. Atlas no longer spoke in council. He wandered the terraces at dusk, his heart torn between his father's silence and his people's blindness. The once luminous gardens of Atlantis had begun to wither at the edges. The sacred bulls, whose lowing once marked the rhythm of their rituals, had gone quiet. The stars above seemed to shift, their familiar constellations dissolving into strange, new forms. The priests called these the turning of the heavens, the sign that the age of the gods was passing, and the age of men had overreached its course. And so the omens multiplied. The water in the central canal turned dark as bronze. The wells began to taste of iron. In the southern quarter, a column of light rose one night from the sea, brilliant as dawn, yet cold as ice. The sailors who saw it said it had no flame, no smoke, only a sound, a low and endless tone that sank into their bones. When it vanished, a silence fell so complete that even the gulls did not cry for 3 days. Those who still kept the old faith gathered in the temple of Poseidon, lighting lamps and singing the ancient hymns. But their voices faltered when the earth began to shake beneath them, a trembling that came not from storm or thunder, but from the heart of the island itself. Cracks spread through the marble floors. Water began to seep upward from the fissures, as though the sea was rising from within. "He comes," whispered the high priest, his eyes reflecting the quivering light. "Our father returns to reclaim what is his." Outside, the kings gathered one last time. Atlas stood before them, his robes torn, his face pale from sleeplessness. "Do you not see?" he cried. "The ocean has turned against us. We have forgotten who we are." But his words fell upon a storm of denial. "You speak madness," said Aziz. "We are Atlanteans, the sea serves us." and Diapreps, his eyes burning with defiance, raised his golden cup and shouted, "If the gods wish to test us, let them come. We are their equals now." At that, lightning split the sky. The wind rose in a single breath, strong enough to topple towers. The mountains in the west glowed red, fire flowing down their slopes in rivers of molten glass. The sea withdrew from the shores as though inhaling, revealing the gleaming seabed for miles. The people, astonished, ran to see the wonder, unaware it was only the beginning. For in the next heartbeat, the ocean returned, higher, heavier, and alive with fury. The first wave shattered the outer walls. The second consumed the harbors. The third, vast as a moving mountain, reached the inner ring. The temple bells rang once, twice, then were swallowed in silence. The canals that had once reflected moonlight now surged with black water. Columns fell like broken trees, statues vanished beneath foam. And through it all, Atlas stood upon the temple's steps, the storm whipping through his hair, his voice lost in the roar of the sea. He looked toward the horizon and thought he saw, for one instant, a vast shadow rising, the form of a god, immense and sorrowful, crowned in lightning. Poseidon's trident glimmered like the dawn. And then the sea closed. When morning came, there was no island, only a vast emptiness where light moved over the water as though searching for what it had lost. The sailors of later ages would sail above that place and speak of the stillness there, how their compasses faltered, how their ships seemed to drift without wind. They called it the navel of the sea, where the world once held its heart. And in the hush of every tide since, the world has remembered. For the sons of Poseidon did not merely vanish, they became the whisper in every empire that rises too high, the reflection in every ruler's mirror, the voice that asks, how long before the sea remembers again? There are echoes that travel farther than sound, the echoes of memory, of civilizations that believed themselves divine. Long after Atlantis sank beneath the waves, its legend still pulsed through time, like the heartbeat of something too vast to die. But before that final night, before the trembling of the deep, there was an age of glory, an age so radiant that even the stars seemed to draw nearer to watch. It was the age of the 10 kings. The island, born from the sea's breath, rose like a jewel between the waters of the Atlantic. From its central hill to the silver beaches at its edge, Atlantis was a world of rings, land and water woven in perfect geometry, as though designed by thought itself. Each ring was alive with purpose, one for the temples, one for the gardens, one for the dwellings of artisans and scholars, one for the fleets that waited like 1,000 sleeping serpents in the harbor. Beyond them stretched the plains, vast and golden, where the people worked with reverence beneath the gaze of their kings. Atlas ruled the center, the heart of the empire. Around him, in perfect symmetry, his 9 brothers governed their provinces: Aziz, Diapreps, Nesius, Elasippus, Mestor, Autochthon, Amphas, Evemen, and Eumelus. 10 kings for 10 rings, 10 voices echoing the will of the divine. Theirs was not a monarchy but a sacred order, a council of blood, bound by the laws of Poseidon himself. Every 5th and 6th year, they gathered in the temple of the sea god, their crowns glinting in the lamplight, the air thick with incense and salt. The temple was built from stone that shimmered like wet coral, its walls inlaid with precious metals drawn from the earth. At its center stood the great column of orichalcum, etched with Poseidon's decrees, commandments older than history. The kings would kneel before it, cutting the throats of the sacred bulls in solemn offering, letting the blood flow across the silver floor. Then they would burn the scrolls of their judgments, the smoke rising through the open roof toward the stars. In this way, their laws were returned to heaven, and Atlantis remained in balance. Each king ruled a realm unique in its splendor. To the north were the mountains of Elasippus, where miners drew fire from the rock, forging weapons and ornaments of unmatched beauty. To the west lay the forests of Nesius, whose timber built ships strong enough to cross oceans. Aziz governed the southern plains, where rivers ran through channels carved by divine hands. Diapreps, fierce and cunning, ruled the outer isles, guarding the empire's borders with fleets that gleamed like wings of glass. And in the center, Atlas watched them all, his throne surrounded by gardens that bloomed in perpetual spring. Under their rule, Atlantis prospered beyond imagination. Its cities were alive with music and laughter. Scholars studied the movement of the stars, engineers built bridges of crystal and stone, and healers drew power from herbs that glowed faintly in moonlight. The people lived long lives, untroubled by famine or war. There were schools of philosophy where students debated the harmony of the soul and the sea, where the question of creation was treated not as mystery, but as inheritance. For they believed themselves children of the divine, not only favored by the gods, but descended from them. Trade flourished across the known world. Ships from Atlantis reached the shores of Egypt, Iberia, and the distant lands that would one day be called the Americas. They brought gold, tin, spices, and sacred writings, leaving behind knowledge and stories that shaped the myths of later civilizations. The Atlanteans were not conquerors then, but teachers. They built temples for foreign gods, mapped the constellations of other skies, and recorded the languages of the nations they met. Their scholars wrote in scripts of spirals and waves, carved into tablets of shell and stone that glistened like frozen water. But even within such harmony, the seeds of change grew. The younger kings, Aziz and Diapreps, began to look upon their brother Atlas with envy. His lands were richest, his cities tallest, his name remembered in every prayer. They began to gather counselors who spoke not of law but of ambition. "Why should we bow forever to the eldest?" they whispered. "Are we not all sons of Poseidon?" And so, within the heart of perfection, division began to stir. Atlas, sensing the shift, sought refuge in the temple's silence. He prayed to the sea for guidance, but the water no longer reflected his image. It had grown dark, opaque, as though hiding its face. He walked the marble corridors where once he had heard the whispers of the divine, but now there was only the faint hum of the wind and the distant pulse of the tide. Even the statue of Poseidon, carved in white stone, seemed colder than before. Its gaze turned toward the horizon rather than the city it had fathered. Still, the kings continued their rituals. Still, the people believed their world eternal. The Empire of 10 Kings stood at the height of its power, a civilization that had tamed the elements, that had captured the light of the gods and bent it to human will. But history, like the sea, moves in tides, and beneath every crest of splendor lies the undertow of decline. For now, though the city sang, the air shimmered with incense and laughter. The canals reflected the stars like veins of living light, and above it all, the 10 kings, proud, radiant, unaware, ruled as though they had eternity in their hands. Yet even in that brightness, the deep was already dreaming. Beneath the perfection of their order, Atlantis had begun to tremble, not with disaster yet, but with the quiet shifting that always comes before the earth remembers its pulse. The 10 kings, resplendent in gold and ivory, believed their dominion absolute. They had mapped the stars, measured the tides, and built an empire that touched the horizon. They forgot that the same sea that bore their ships could also bury them. From the outer provinces came stories of restlessness. Farmers spoke of wells that bubbled with warm water even in winter. Fishermen found their nets torn by unseen forces. Birds that once followed the trade winds vanished, their migrations broken. The priests read these signs in silence, tracing their omens in salt and ash, yet they dared not speak openly. The kings, in their pride, had grown weary of prophecy. The Council of 10 still gathered beneath the great dome of Poseidon's temple, a roof of silver that caught the moonlight like a bowl of light. There they reaffirmed their ancient laws, the ones etched upon the column of orichalcum that rose from the floor like a vein of living flame. But as they spoke the words, something had changed in their tone. The old reverence was gone, their voices were loud, their gestures sharp. The air that had once trembled with awe now echoed with argument. Aziz was the first to challenge Atlas openly. "Brother," he said, his voice steady as stone, "your throne stands higher than ours, your city richer. The temple lies within your ring, yet we all share the blood of Poseidon. Should not the wealth of Atlantis be divided among all?" Atlas answered with calm, but the stillness in his voice carried warning. "The wealth you seek is not mine," he said, "but the sea's. Take from it as you wish. but remember, it takes back more than it gives. Diapreps, his eyes gleaming like polished obsidian, smiled thinly. Then we shall see how generous the sea can be. The others murmured agreement. Thus began the age of rivalry, the slow, quiet unraveling of divine unity. Atlantis, vast and magnificent, began to mirror its ruler's division. Provinces competed in beauty and power. Cities raced to build taller towers, grander temples, greater ships. The outer rings, once humble and green, filled with mansions and monuments of excess. Gold that had once adorned temples now gilded the palaces of men. In the marketplaces, merchants no longer offered sacrifices to Poseidon before weighing their goods. They prayed to profit, to luck, to themselves. The old priests withdrew from public life. They returned to their sanctuaries near the mountains, where the smell of incense still mingled with the sound of waterfalls. They watched as the balance tipped, slowly, invisibly, away from reverence toward pride. When men call themselves gods, said the eldest among them, the gods begin to remember their names. And yet, even amid decline, Atlantis shone brighter than any kingdom before or after. The streets were lined with marble statues of heroes and kings. Fountains shaped like dolphins poured streams of scented water. The ports gleamed with ships of impossible craft, vessels that could travel for months without resupply, their sails woven from silver-threaded cloth that caught every whisper of wind. It was said the Atlanteans had discovered a way to draw energy from the magnetic heart of the earth itself. Fire burned without fuel in crystal globes that illuminated their libraries at night. Their knowledge of medicine could knit wounds that would have killed a lesser man. Their scholars wrote of the living pulse, the invisible current that linked all things. It was a civilization both divine and doomed, for nothing that perfect can survive its own reflection. One evening, Atlas stood upon the highest terrace of the capital, the sea stretching endlessly before him. The sun was setting in bands of crimson and violet, the water catching its light like liquid glass. Around him, the city glowed, domes and towers painted gold by the dying day. Yet in that beauty, he felt an unease he could not name. He sensed the shifting beneath, not of stone, but of spirit. He called upon Nesius, his brother of the western forests, who was the most faithful among them. Together they walked through the silent corridors of the temple, their footsteps echoing softly upon the stone. "Do you hear it?" Atlas asked. Nesius listened, and from the depths of the earth came a faint murmur, a vibration, steady and low, like a heartbeat too vast to belong to any living creature. "It is the sea," said Nesius at last. "It dreams." Atlas nodded, his gaze fixed upon the horizon. "Then may it dream kindly." But the sea, as the old myths tell us, dreams in cycles, not kindly, not cruelly, only truthfully. It remembers all that is forgotten. It answers when called, whether by prayer or by pride. That night, the stars above Atlantis burned brighter than they ever had before. Some said they were blessings. Others, who watched them flicker and fall into the dark, thought they were warnings. And beneath that same sky, the 10 kings, once brothers, now rivals, slept in their golden halls, unaware that their empire had already begun to sink, not into the sea, but into its own reflection. In the waning centuries of Atlantis, splendor became a mask for fear. The 10 kings, though arrayed in glory, ruled a world that no longer listened to the sea. Their temples glowed with perpetual light, their feasts overflowed with song and flame, but their eyes were restless, for the balance that had sustained them between the divine and the mortal was fracturing. They had built their cities higher, their fleets larger, their palaces more magnificent, but in the hollow between stone and silence, something sacred had fled. The people felt it first. They noticed the stillness in the mornings when the sea failed to sing against the harbor walls. Fishermen said the tides no longer obeyed their clocks or stars. The birds that once heralded dawn had begun to circle aimlessly, their cries sharp as grief. Priests of Poseidon called it the turning of the blood, the moment when divinity withdrew from mortal flesh. But when they brought this prophecy to the royal court, the kings only laughed. "We are the children of the deep," said Diapreps. The sea cannot forsake its own blood. Yet even laughter could not hide the cracks forming beneath the gold. In the western provinces, the forests turned to dust. Rivers grew shallow, their currents choked with silt. The once-green plains of Aziz became brittle under the sun, as if some vast heat had risen from within the earth. The shepherds saw their flocks wander toward the shore at dusk and stand there, gazing at the horizon in silence. The elders said they were listening for something, the echo of their maker returning. Atlas, haunted by dreams of water and fire, gathered the council once more in the great hall of the temple. The air within was thick with incense and unease. The golden statue of Poseidon loomed above them, its trident piercing the ceiling like a wound in the sky. Atlas spoke with quiet gravity. "Brothers," he began, "the signs are upon us. The earth quakes beneath our feet. The sea has turned against us. These are not storms of chance, but warnings. We have forgotten who we are." Aziz rose first, his face proud, his voice sharp as bronze. "You speak of omens like an old priest. The people need not fear the sea. It serves our will, as it always has." "The sea serves no will," Atlas replied, his tone soft but cutting. "It remembers." Diapreps laughed, the sound echoing off the marble like a crack in the world. "Then let it remember, let it see what its children have become. We are not its servants, we are its masters." The chamber fell into silence. Even the torches seemed to shrink from his words. Atlas lowered his gaze, feeling the old truth tighten around his heart, that no empire born of the divine can endure once it turns against its source. That night he walked alone through the city. The streets that had once thrummed with life were eerily quiet. The fountains, fed by the sacred channels, had stopped flowing. Beneath the moonlight, the marble walls seemed to breathe, as if the city itself were waiting. He looked to the harbor where the ships lay still, their sails slack against the mast. The tide was unusually high, licking at the edge of the docks. A scent hung in the air, sharp, metallic, electric. The world was holding its breath. In the central courtyard, the priests had gathered, chanting low hymns to Poseidon. Their voices trembled, not from faith, but from dread. The high priest, old and blind, turned his face toward Atlas as he approached. "It is done," he whispered. "He has withdrawn his gaze. The sea will soon remember what belongs to it." And then the ground shuddered. It began as a distant tremor, the kind that shakes dust from rooftops and ripples water in cups. But within moments, the trembling deepened into a roar. The columns of the temple quivered, mosaics shattered. From the western hills, a plume of red light tore through the sky. Fire met water, and the air filled with steam and lightning. The people poured into the streets, crying to their gods, to their kings, to anyone who might still listen. Atlas raised his hands toward the heavens and shouted above the chaos, "Mercy, Father, if we have strayed, forgive us. Let not the sea devour its children." But the thunder answered, not with words, but with a voice of endless depth, the voice of the ocean itself. A sound followed, low, vast, and mournful, as though the deep were drawing its breath. The sea began to retreat, its surface rippling with unnatural rhythm. The sailors screamed, pointing to the horizon, where the water was vanishing, leaving behind a plain of glistening sand and shattered coral. Fish flopped helplessly in the sun. The children of Atlantis watched in awe, not yet knowing the meaning of what they saw. And then came the return. A single wave rose from the horizon, not rolling, not breaking, but lifting, swelling, becoming. It towered above the sky, a wall of moving glass crowned with lightning and flame. The wind shrieked. The bells of the temple tolled once, twice, then were swallowed by the roar. The wave struck the outer rings first, obliterating the harbors, the ships, the markets. The second consumed the gardens and the dwellings of the craftsmen. The third, vast and merciless, reached the inner circle, shattering the temple of Poseidon itself. Atlas saw the golden statue fall, its trident breaking as it struck the marble floor. For an instant, the flame of the sacred lamp still burned in the flood, a small, trembling light, and then it vanished beneath the rising sea. The empire of 10 kings was no more. The city that had rivaled heaven sank in silence, swallowed whole by the womb from which it had been born. But the sea did not forget. For ages afterward, sailors crossing that place would feel their ships slow, as though the waters were heavy with memory. Some claim they saw lights beneath the surface, faint, golden flickers, like the reflection of a city dreaming below. Others said they heard music, distant, sorrowful, echoing through the deep, the song of Atlantis. And perhaps it still sings, for the sea remembers everything. Before the flood, the world was not as we know it. The earth was broader then, its continents not yet torn by the slow violence of time. Mountains were young, rivers unbroken, and the air was heavy with warmth. The sea stood higher in spirit if not yet in form, as though waiting for its appointed hour. Humanity walked softly across the plains, unaware that beneath the soil lay the breath of 1,000 futures. It was an age of peace, but also of blindness, the calm before memory itself was drowned. To understand Atlantis, one must see the world that bore it. The ancient writers spoke not of continents, but of realms, great circles of land surrounded by eternal waters. There was Lemuria in the east, Mu in the distant west, and beyond them, the nameless islands of the dawn. But among them all, Atlantis was the crown, set in the middle of the ocean like the heart between two lungs. From its shores, one could sail to any edge of the world. It was the bridge between worlds, between the gods and mankind, between the past and the coming deluge. The Atlanteans were not alone in their greatness. Across the earth, other kingdoms had begun to stir. In the valleys of the Nile, priest-kings raised obelisks to the sun, their shadows marking time like the hands of a cosmic clock. In Mesopotamia, men shaped bricks of clay and carved into them the first language. In the mountains of Anatolia and the islands of the Aegean, temples rose to strange deities, gods of thunder, fertility, and flame. Each civilization mirrored the same pattern, knowledge rising from silence, order growing from chaos. And though they knew it not, they were all heirs to a single origin, the lost light of Atlantis. For Atlantis had not merely ruled by might but by wisdom. Its scholars had sailed across the seas, teaching geometry, astronomy, and the sacred laws of measure. They understood the music of the spheres, how the planets moved in rhythm like dancers in divine procession. From their teachings, the priests of Egypt learned the secrets of stone and shadow. From their laws, the sages of Sumer drew the first tablets of justice. And from their fall, the world inherited its oldest warning, that no empire, however God-born, escapes the cycles of the earth. The flood was not merely water, it was the consequence of imbalance, of a world tilted too far toward its own power. The ancients saw it not as accident, but as correction. The Atlanteans had reached beyond the bounds of their covenant. They had sought to command nature rather than commune with it. And so nature, weary of their arrogance, rose in answer. Legends across the world preserve the echo of that rising. The priests of Egypt spoke of a time when the Nile ran backward. The Sumerians told of Enlil's wrath, when the heavens wept for 7 days and nights. In the tablets of Gilgamesh, the waters covered the mountains, and the Ark of Utnapishtim came to rest upon the peaks of Ararat. In the Hindu Satapatha Brahmana, Manu was warned by the fish god to build a vessel before the great flood came. Even in the forgotten myths of the Americas, the elders tell of a deluge that swallowed the first people and remade the earth. All these stories, scattered and luminous, are fragments of a single memory, the day the world began again. Perhaps the flood was not one event, but many, a rhythm of destruction and renewal written into the bones of the planet. The ice that once covered the poles melted and sent rivers across continents. The Earth's crust shifted, breaking mountains and birthing seas. Islands vanished beneath rising tides, their temples dissolving into coral and silence. In the darkness that followed, fire and water danced, the twin forces of creation reclaiming their dominion. Yet in every story, a remnant survives. The gods, it is said, always preserve a seed, a handful of souls, a single city, a man who remembers. When Atlantis fell, the survivors fled to the corners of the world. Some reached Egypt and became the first dynasties of kings. Some crossed into Iberia and built shrines of stone that still whisper their geometry to the wind. Others wandered east, carrying with them fragments of lost science, which they wove into myth until it became indistinguishable from prayer. And so the memory of Atlantis lived on, not in maps, but in symbols. The spiral, the trident, the temple that mirrors the heavens. The world before the flood became the world after it, wearing a new name but carrying the same dream. Humanity forgot the place, but not the pattern. Every city that rose from the dust, Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, Greece, was a reflection of that drowned perfection, an attempt to rebuild what the sea had taken. The priests of old said that time moves in circles, not lines, that every age ascends to light and then descends again into shadow. Atlantis was not the first, nor would it be the last. There were worlds before it, and there will be worlds after, each one repeating the same divine rhythm: creation, arrogance, destruction, remembrance. When the waters finally receded, they left behind a silence so vast that even the gods seemed to have withdrawn. But in that silence was possibility. From the mud and ruin rose new tongues, new faiths, new visions. The earth was cleansed, the balance restored, and humanity, reborn, looked to the stars, not as masters, but as seekers once more. It is said that the flood did not destroy Atlantis, it baptized it. For in drowning, it was purified of pride, returned to its element, made one again with the divine it had forgotten. Perhaps that is why the ocean remains so calm when the wind dies. It is the peace of something that has already wept, already remembered. The world before the flood was a mirror, and the world after it a reflection. Between them lies only water. When the waters began to rise, the world did not tremble at once. It began with small signs, tides that climbed higher than memory, storms that lingered beyond their season, rivers that forgot their boundaries. The priests of the old temples spoke of imbalance in the heavens, of constellations shifting their stations, of the breath of the gods turning heavy with grief. But kings and scholars, wrapped in their certainties, called it the restlessness of nature and built their palaces closer to the shore. In those days, Atlantis still stood, though its heart had grown hollow. Its priests had fled to the mountains to guard the sacred texts, while the cities filled with the noise of markets and feasts. The harbors swelled with ships carrying treasure and slaves. The air shimmered with the heat of ambition. Few noticed that the sea had changed its voice. It no longer sang as it once did, but murmured like a thing remembering itself. In the east, the skies grew red for 7 days and nights. The stars faded behind a veil of ash. Volcanoes tore open the bones of the earth, spilling fire into the sea. Great waves rose where they had never been, sweeping over islands that vanished in a single breath. The elders in the temples of sighs recorded the omens. The sea has turned against its children. The gods withdraw their light. In the mountains of Anatolia, shepherds watched the rivers swell until the valleys became lakes of silence. Even the winds seemed lost, blowing in circles as though searching for their origin. But there were those who remembered the old teachings, fragments of Atlantean wisdom that had survived through whispers and glyphs. Among them was a circle of astronomer priests who watched the sky with unease. They saw the stars align in a pattern that had not appeared since the world's birth, a sign of reckoning, when the balance of fire and water would again be renewed. They gathered their disciples and spoke softly, "This is not the end. It is the return. The sea reclaims what was lent." From the western edge of the known world came reports of islands shattering like glass. The horizon itself seemed to bend, as though the weight of the ocean pressed against the sky. And in every port, people spoke of the same dream, of a voice calling from beneath the waves, neither cruel nor kind, only vast and sorrowful. Some called it Poseidon, others the soul of the earth itself. Egypt, the priests of Thoth built sanctuaries far from the Nile's reach. They carved into the stone the story of a city that had angered the sea, warning future kings to build upon rock, not pride. In Mesopotamia, the scribes of Eridu inscribed the tale of Enki's mercy, of the god who whispered to one righteous man to build a vessel before the flood arrived. The stories differed in name, but their heart was the same. The divine had turned, not in rage, but in sorrow, to restore the world it had made. And then the silence broke. The ocean began to rise, not as a wave, but as a tide that did not recede. Day after day, the waters climbed the temple's steps, swallowing gardens, markets, and fields. The people fled to the hills, their songs replaced by cries. The winds roared without direction, the rain fell without mercy. Thunder rolled across the earth for 7 nights, as though the sky itself had become a drum of judgment. And when the storm finally passed, there was no sound left, only the breathing of the sea, endless and unbroken. Where once there had been continents, there was now a single shimmering plain. The ruins of cities drifted beneath the surface like forgotten dreams. The towers of Atlantis, now coral and stone, slept in blue stillness. The world had been made new, and the gods, having restored the balance, withdrew once more into silence. Yet even then, life began again. Upon the mountain peaks and the scattered islands that survived, the few who had fled began to rebuild. They carried with them stories, memories, and fragments of light, the remnants of a wisdom that would seed the next age. They taught their children of a world that once was perfect and how it fell, so that they might remember when the cycle returned. And perhaps it is still turning, for the sea does not forget its patterns, and neither does the heart of man. Every empire that rises carries within it the reflection of the flood, every generation the echo of that ancient warning that the waters are patient and the earth never sleeps forever. After the waters claimed the earth, silence descended, not the silence of death, but of beginning. The air was heavy and still, and the sea spread like a mirror that reached the horizon, unbroken by sail or shore. The sun rose each morning into a world remade, its light softer, as if remembering what it had witnessed. The mountains that survived stood as islands in a new ocean, their peaks veiled in mist. Upon them, the remnants of humankind began to gather, dazed, silent, and anciently humbled. They had seen the world end, and yet still they lived. For many days they spoke little, for words seemed unworthy of what the eyes had seen. The sky itself appeared to grieve, its color pale, its clouds low and swollen with mourning. The survivors built fires on the mountaintops, not as signals, but as prayers, flames of gratitude and remorse. They believed that perhaps the gods, in their mercy, had spared them not for their righteousness, but to remember. And so they became keepers of memory, guardians of the story that the sea had washed away. Among them were those who had come from Atlantis, priests, scribes, wanderers who had escaped the fury of the deep by chance or providence. They carried no riches, no gold, no weapons, only the weight of what they had known. In their minds still echoed the sound of the sea swallowing their cities, the thunder of collapsing temples, the final cry of the wind. They spoke softly of a land that had once touched the stars, of wisdom that bridged heaven and earth, of a beauty so perfect that even the gods had envied it. And wherever they went, their words became the seeds of myth. In Egypt, they became the followers of Horus, sages who brought geometry and the calendar, teaching the priests to read the language of the sky. They built shrines aligned with the stars, as Atlantis had done, believing that harmony could yet be restored if man learned again to measure with reverence. In Mesopotamia, they became the Abgalu, the 7 sages of Eridu, who taught writing, architecture, and law. In Greece, they would later be remembered as the Danans, children of the sea god who founded cities and brought art to men. And in every corner of the world where their descendants walked, the same pattern returned: the triangle, the spiral, the trident, the signs of a memory too deep to name. The flood had not erased Atlantis, it had scattered it. Its spirit was dissolved into the veins of the world, carried in language, in architecture, in the symbols of faith. The pyramids, the ziggurats, the temples of the Andes, all were echoes of that first geometry, the attempt of man to reach upward as he once did, to reflect heaven upon the earth. And though no one remembered the city's name, its shape lived on in stone, in dream, in the rhythm of creation itself. The priests of Sais would later say to Solon, "You Greeks are children, you remember nothing of the world that was." They spoke with the patience of those who had preserved a truth older than civilization, that time moves in cycles, and that before every dawn there must be a flood. For they believed that humanity, like the sea, has tides rising toward the divine, then falling again into pride. Each flood, each destruction, was not an end, but a purification, washing the world clean for its next awakening. And yet somewhere beneath the waves, the ruins still glowed. The deep sea remembers differently than the land, it preserves through stillness. The temples of Atlantis, now covered in coral and silence, stood like bones of a sleeping god. The great statue of Poseidon lay upon its side, half buried in sand, its trident reaching toward the sun that no longer touched it. And though the sea was vast, those who sailed above its heart sometimes felt the pull of something below, a gravity of memory, a whisper that seemed to rise through the water. In the long centuries that followed, the survivors' children grew into nations. They tilled the new earth, worshipped new gods, and built cities from the dust. But in their dreams, they saw a place of light beneath the sea, and when they woke, they painted its image on walls, wove it into stories, sang it as lullaby and lament. The story of Atlantis became the soul's remembrance of a perfection lost, of a home drowned but not destroyed. The flood receded, the earth healed, and time began again. But the lesson of the waters was not forgotten, that pride summons the tide, that the sea gives and takes in equal measure, and that every civilization built too close to heaven must one day be humbled by the deep. And thus the new world began, born from ruin, baptized in silence. The age before the flood had ended, but its echo would guide the rise of all that came after. For the sea, eternal and patient, had written the truth in salt, that creation is not lost in drowning, it is only changed. Began, as endings often do, with beauty too great to bear. The city stood radiant upon the sea, its towers of white marble rising like frozen light, its domes shining gold beneath a sky so blue it seemed woven from glass. The harbors were filled with ships, their sails whispering in the wind like prayer flags. The scent of myrrh drifted through the air, fountains murmured in the courtyards, and in the central temple, the flames upon Poseidon's altar burned with a steady, immortal glow. To the people of Atlantis, this beauty was proof of divine favor, the promise that their kingdom would never fall. But perfection, when untended by humility, becomes its own undoing. The Atlanteans no longer remembered the silence from which they had risen. They looked to the sea and saw not their creator, but their reflection. The priests who once sang hymns at dawn now sang to the power of kings. The artisans who once carved the gods in stone now carved their rulers' faces in gold. And in the hearts of the people, reverence turned quietly into pride. Atlas, the eldest of Poseidon's sons, watched from his high throne as the harmony of ages began to fray. The temple bells rang out each morning, but their music no longer stirred the soul. The markets grew louder, the palaces richer, and the nights more restless. Even the stars above seemed to drift from their ancient paths, as if the heavens themselves were withdrawing their blessing. "The balance is shifting," the priests whispered. "The sea dreams of us again." The first tremors came in secret, soft, almost tender, as though the earth were breathing in its sleep. The farmers felt it in the soil beneath their feet, the sailors in the pull of their anchors. A new wind began to blow from the west, carrying the scent of metal and rain, but the kings dismissed it as a season's change. "The gods have favored us," they said. "Our walls are eternal, our ships rule the horizon." And yet, beneath those confident words, the old fear, the fear of the sea's memory, began to stir. At dusk, Atlas climbed to the temple of Poseidon, the same place where his father had once crowned the island in divine geometry. He stood before the statue of the god, tall and silent, its trident glimmering in the half-light. "Father," he whispered, "I have kept your covenant. Why does the sea grow restless?" No voice answered him, but the torches flickered, and from deep within the marble floor came the faintest hum, low and mournful, like the song of the tide beneath stone. In the days that followed, the signs multiplied. The fountains ran dark with silt, the sacred bulls refused to eat. The winds that once circled the island in harmony now clashed and broke against one another. And in the western horizon, a shadow began to rise, not of cloud, but of water. The council of 10 kings assembled, their faces grave but proud. They met beneath the vaulted roof of the Golden Hall, where murals of their victories glimmered upon the walls. Atlas spoke first. "The sea warns us. We must return to the old ways, to prayer, to sacrifice, to silence." But Diapreps, whose arrogance was equal to his power, rose and said, "You mistake the tremors for punishment. I see them as awakening. The world trembles because it fears us. We have surpassed even the gods." A murmur of approval swept the chamber. Aziz, his eyes bright with ambition, added, "If the gods are displeased, let them behold our strength. Let us build higher, farther, greater, so that heaven itself will envy our glory." Atlas turned from them, his heart heavy. "Then you have already condemned us," he said softly, "for the sea does not envy, it remembers." That night the moon rose blood-red, its reflection trembling across the waters. The wind fell still. The city, unaware of its last dawn, slept in false peace. Yet in the temples, the priests knelt upon cold stone, their prayers drowned by a sound too deep to name, a vibration rising through the earth, ancient and patient, the voice of the ocean awakening. And then came the dawn that never ended. The sun rose into a sky streaked with fire. The ground trembled beneath the city, and from the sea came a roar that silenced every voice. The first wave struck the outer ring like the hand of a god. Walls that had stood for centuries crumbled in seconds. The harbors filled with boiling water, ships were lifted and shattered like toys. The air was filled with screams and thunder, and yet above it all came one sound, the deep, endless pulse of the sea reclaiming its own. The temples fell, the palaces shattered, and the streets that once echoed with laughter became rivers of flame and foam. The statue of Poseidon, carved in eternal marble, split from crown to base. Its trident fell, shattering the floor of the sanctuary. The sacred lamp went out, its light swallowed by the flood. Atlas stood upon the steps of the great hall, his robes whipping in the wind, and watched as his city dissolved into chaos. Around him, lightning struck the towers, fire met water, and the sky became a burning sea. He closed his eyes and whispered the last prayer of Atlantis, "Father, remember us not for our pride, but for our beginning." And as the final wave rose, vast and luminous, its crest glowing like molten glass, it seemed to pause, as if to listen. Then, with a sound like the breath of creation itself, it fell. The shining city was gone. All that remained was silence, and beneath that silence, the slow rhythm of the deep, carrying the memory of what had been. For though Atlantis perished, it was not lost. The sea, ever merciful in its own way, kept its image in its heart, a reflection waiting to be seen again when the world was ready to remember. And so the age of the gods ended, and the age of men began. The storm did not end in a day. The destruction of Atlantis was not a single moment of wrath, but a slow, deliberate unraveling, as if the sea itself were taking its time to remember every stone, every name, every forgotten prayer before claiming them. What had begun with wind and trembling earth became an endless symphony of ruin. The sky cracked with fire, the waters seethed with lightning. The island screamed as it sank, its voice echoing through time. The people fled to the higher terraces, dragging their children, their relics, their idols. Some sought refuge in the temples, believing the gods would protect their walls. Others ran toward the docks, though the sea had already devoured their ships. The priests of Poseidon stood in their flooded sanctuaries, chanting the words that had once commanded the tide, but the water rose with no reverence, now indifferent, obedient only to itself. Atlas moved through the chaos like a man between worlds. His robes were torn, his hair matted with rain and ash, but his eyes were calm, not with peace, but with understanding. He had seen this before long ago in the dreams that visited him on quiet nights, the waves climbing the temples, the fires bursting from the earth, the trident broken. He had hoped they were only visions of warning. Now he knew they were remembrance, the memory of every age that had ever reached too high. He found Nesius, his loyal brother, among the priests who tried to save the sacred archives. Together they carried the tablets, maps of the heavens, laws of geometry, hymns written in the tongue of the gods, to the highest chamber of the temple. Even if we perish, Atlas said, these words must endure. They sealed the scrolls in orichalcum chests, pressing the seals of the 10 kings upon the lids. Let the sea keep them, whispered Nessius, until the world is worthy again. Outside, the island was breaking. Cracks split the streets, swallowing houses whole. Fire rose from the fissures, meeting the flood in clouds of boiling steam. The scent of salt and smoke filled the air. In the western sky, a mountain erupted, its summit shattered by lightning. The ash turned the day to night. The people fell to their knees, crying out the names of gods who no longer answered. In the final hours, the surviving kings gathered in the Hall of Fire, or what remained of it. The walls leaned inward, the mosaics of their victories crumbling beneath their feet. Diapreps, who had once laughed at the omens, now stood trembling. Atlas, he cried, command the sea, you are Poseidon's heir. Atlas turned to him slowly. The sea is no longer listening, he said. It is speaking. The hall collapsed around them. Diapreps was buried beneath the marble, his voice silenced mid-plea. Aziz fled toward the cliffs, but the wave found him before the edge. The others vanished into the mist, their names carried away by wind. Only Atlas remained standing as the waters reached the temple steps. He looked once more at the sky, now split by lightning and smoke, and whispered, so be it. The final wave rose, immense and golden in the dying light. It did not crash but lifted the entire island, turning it weightless for a breathless instant. The towers gleamed, suspended between sea and sky, as if heaven itself had paused to look upon its reflection. Then slowly the island tilted. The temples, the harbors, the walls, all slid into the churning abyss. Silence followed. The storm receded as if exhaling, leaving behind only foam and fragments, shards of marble, broken idols, the ashes of kings. The sea grew still again, as though it had never moved. The sun returned, pale and distant, shining upon a horizon empty of land. In the depths below, the ruins settled. The temples became reefs, the palaces turned to coral. Fish swam through the colonnades, their scales glinting where torches once burned. And far below, in the sacred chamber sealed by Atlas and Nessius, the chests of orichalcum rested in perfect darkness. The water was cold, but the words within remained untouched, waiting, dreaming, remembering. For the sea, though merciless, is never forgetful. It buries what it loves, not to destroy it, but to keep it safe. And somewhere in that vast and secret heart, Atlantis still breathes, not as city or stone, but as memory. Above, the survivors who had fled before the storm looked back from their ships. They saw only the horizon, endless and empty. Some said they heard a faint hum from the deep, like a heartbeat beneath the waves. Others said they saw light, a soft, golden glow, before it vanished into the dark. They wept, but they did not understand, for the sea had not taken Atlantis out of anger, it had only brought it home. The sea remembers softly. Beneath its endless blue, where sunlight fades into green silence, the ghosts of Atlantis drift, not as wraiths or spirits, but as memories that refuse to dissolve. There, among the coral and the shadow of mountains now swallowed by water, lie the remnants of a world that once touched the divine. The waves that pass above do not know what lies below them, but the deep remembers. It hums, low and patient, carrying through the centuries the echo of what was lost. When the storm had passed and the surface stilled, the survivors found themselves scattered like seeds across the edge of the world. Some washed ashore upon the coasts of Egypt and Libya. Others reached the lands that would one day be called Greece or the far western isles of the Atlantic. They came with nothing, no ships, no tools, no gold, only the memory of their drowned home. Yet even that was enough to reshape the world. The Egyptians would later tell Solon that their ancestors were not the first men, but the reborn. Many times has the world been destroyed by water and by fire, said the priests of sighs, and each time a few are saved to begin again. They spoke of strangers who had come to them from the west after a great flood, tall and pale, with eyes like the color of the sea. They carried knowledge of stars and stone, of measures and harmony. They taught the priests to build temples whose shadows marked the solstices, to carve symbols that would outlast wind and time. The strangers stayed for a generation, then vanished, leaving behind geometry, myth, and memory. In other lands, they became legends. Among the peoples of Iberia, they were remembered as the sea kings who built stone circles and taught the making of bronze. Among the tribes of the Aegean, they were the Pelagoi, the people of the sea, who came from a shining city that the ocean had swallowed. In the mountains of Anatolia, they were the sons of the Trident, builders of walls so perfect that even after millennia they would stand unmoved. Everywhere they went, they carried the same symbols: the spiral, the triangle, the eye, the waves that encircled the world. These were not merely refugees, they were keepers of a covenant older than history. They had watched the gods withdraw, had felt the sea's judgment, and yet they still believed in the order that had once bound heaven and earth. They built new temples, smaller, humbler, but precise in proportion, imitations of the geometry of Atlantis. In Egypt, their sacred measure became the cubit; in Sumer, the sa; in Greece, the golden ratio. Each was a fragment of the divine mathematics that had once governed their lost home. But their greatest gift was not architecture, it was remembrance. They taught the art of storytelling, not as mere tale, but as vessel. Every myth, every hymn, every legend that came after Atlantis bore traces of their sorrow. The story of a flood that cleansed the earth. The story of gods who fell in love with mortals and bore hybrid children. The story of a golden age destroyed by the arrogance of men. These were not inventions. They were memories transcribed into the language of dream. The echoes deepened through time. The Atlanteans who survived became wanderers, priests, poets. In their blood flowed both grief and wisdom. Their children were born with strange dreams of cities beneath water, of voices calling from the deep. Some said these were curses, others blessings, but always the sea followed them. It became their oracle, their mirror, their fear. No matter how far they traveled, they built their homes near its edge, as if longing to return. And in the depths, the city slept. The ruins of Atlantis became a world unto themselves, forests of coral blooming through marble halls, silverfish darting between columns once inscribed with lore. The temples no longer sang with human voices, but with the slow music of the tide. The statues of the gods stood tilted in the dark, their faces softened by silt, their eyes filled with pearls. And yet, when the light from the surface touched them, they seemed to glow as though remembering the sun. Sailors who crossed those waters centuries later told of strange lights beneath the sea, of shadows that moved like walls, of music that rose through the hulls of their ships. They feared the place, calling it the navel of the ocean, a realm where compasses failed and dreams became strange. Some said they heard whispers in unknown tongues. Others claimed they saw cities reflected in the waves where none should be. When they returned to shore, their hair had turned white, and their eyes were haunted by the sight of beauty too vast for memory. The priests of later ages called it the Sea of Remembrance. They believed that all souls lost to the waters wandered there until the end of time, not in torment, but in contemplation. The drowned were not dead, they were dreaming. And from their dreams rose the great myths that shaped humanity's second birth. For every ruin leaves an echo, and every echo becomes a story. Atlantis, though sunk, became the pulse of human longing, the archetype of paradise lost, of knowledge drowned, of pride redeemed through sorrow. In every temple raised after it, in every flood remembered, in every song sung to the ocean, the same rhythm returned: creation, destruction, and the yearning for what lies beneath. The Atlanteans were gone, but their memory was the world's inheritance, for the sea had not ended them. It had transformed them from rulers into myth, from city into legend, from pride into prayer. And deep below, the ruins whispered still. The ocean does not bury, it preserves. Time above the surface may forget, but beneath, in the endless dark where sound becomes memory, the past lingers whole. There, in the quiet belly of the deep, Atlantis did not vanish, it transformed. Its marble streets turned to forests of coral, its walls to reefs that glowed with ghostly fire. The palaces where kings had walked now shimmered with the slow dance of silver fish. The inscriptions of lore and prophecy were softened by silt, but the words were not lost. They were being rewritten by the water in a language only eternity could read. Those who survived the flood carried pieces of that language within them. They did not know it, not consciously, but when they built with harmony. When they prayed with rhythm. When they told their children stories of gods, floods, and rebirth, they were translating the whispers that rose in their blood, echoes of the drowned city still humming in the veins of humankind. In Egypt, the memory took form in stone. The first dynasties raised temples aligned with the stars of Orion, believing that the soul of the king must ascend along the same celestial pathways once charted by the Atlantean sages. The Great Pyramid itself, vast and silent, was not a tomb, but a memory device, a mountain of remembrance carved from the desert, pointing forever to the heavens that had once guided ships across the Western Sea. Its angles sang the same geometry that once ruled Atlantis, the divine proportion, the measure of balance between earth and sky. In Mesopotamia, where rivers replaced the ocean, they built ziggurats, layered mountains that reached toward the divine. The priests of Ur and Eridu spoke of a shining city before the flood, where gods walked among men and taught them the art of measure. They called it Aralu, Dilmun, or Ziusudra's realm. Names changed, but meaning endured. The myth of a world lost beneath the waters, waiting to rise again when men remembered the law of the heavens. Even in the Far East, the dream persisted. In India, the Vedic seers told of Dwarka, the city of Krishna, submerged by the sea after its king departed to heaven. In the Americas, the Maya spoke of Aztlan, the ancestral home that sank beneath the waves. The Pacific Islanders sang of Lemuria, the motherland of light. Each was a different echo of the same voice, carried by survivors who no longer remembered their origin, only the sorrow of having lost it. The echoes reached not only through geography, but through the soul. The flood changed the very rhythm of human thought. Before it, mankind believed himself immortal, born from divine blood. After it, he became humble, a creature of dust, destined to return to dust. The knowledge of the sea's power, of its mercy and its vengeance, lived in the bones of every culture thereafter. It birthed religion, awe, and the eternal search for meaning. Humanity had seen the face of its maker in the rising tide, and understood that to forget reverence was to summon the flood again. Yet within that humility, something luminous remained. The Atlantean dream did not die, it was transformed into yearning. From that yearning came civilization's greatest gifts: art, science, philosophy. Every cathedral built toward the heavens, every poem sung to the sea, every discovery that sought to understand the stars, all were attempts to rebuild Atlantis in spirit, to reclaim what had been lost in form. Centuries passed, the waters cooled, the ruins below grew calm and overgrown, but in certain moments, when the moon hung low over the horizon, or when the sea turned still as glass, sailors swore they could hear music rising from the depths, not the sound of waves, but of voices, slow, mournful, and unbearably beautiful. The ancients called it the singing of the drowned. They believed it was the chorus of Atlantis itself, echoing across the ages to remind mankind of the covenant that had been broken. Some who heard it were driven to madness. Others were inspired to creation. The poets of Greece claimed that the muses were born from the sea's song, 9 spirits rising from the waters to gift humanity with remembrance through art. The philosophers who pondered the order of the cosmos said that the harmony of the spheres was that same oceanic hum translated into celestial form. Even in the scriptures of later faiths, when prophets spoke of paradise lost, of floods and reckonings, the undertone remained the same, the voice of the deep, whispering the memory of what had once been perfect. For the sea, though vast and cruel, is not without compassion. It keeps the memories of all that it takes, not to punish, but to protect. The Atlanteans, the cities, the songs, all sleep within it, waiting for a time when the world will listen again without pride, when mankind can hear the ocean's voice and not fear it. Until then, the echoes remain in dream, in story, in every tide that kisses the shore. And sometimes, when the waves fall into stillness and the wind dies, if one listens closely, one might hear it, the distant hum of a city beneath the sea, the heartbeat of a memory that refuses to fade. The sea, as ever, remembers. The story of Atlantis did not end with its drowning. It became a current that moved through time, subtle yet unstoppable, pulling poets, kings, philosophers, and dreamers toward its unseen shore. The sea had taken the city, but it had not taken its question, and that question haunted the human spirit more deeply than any ruin left above the waves. Was it real? It began, as so many resurrections do, with a story retold. In the halls of ancient Greece, where wisdom was spoken like song, the philosopher Plato recorded the tale. He claimed it was no myth but memory, passed down from the Egyptian priests of Sais to Solon, and from Solon to Critias, until it reached him, a tale 10,000 years old, of a mighty island beyond the pillars of Heracles that had once warred against the world and vanished in a single night. Plato did not write it as a legend, but as a warning that all empires, no matter how divine, carry within them the weight of their own destruction. Yet from the moment the ink dried, his readers were divided. Some saw metaphor, the parable of hubris and fall. Others heard truth disguised in poetry. And there were those who felt, deep within, that the sea itself had whispered to Plato, using his hand to write its memory. Across centuries, men argued, searched, dreamed. Where the philosopher offered mystery, the human heart demanded proof. The first seekers were mystics. To them, Atlantis was not a place, but a state of being, the lost paradise within the soul. The Pythagoreans spoke of the island as an echo of divine geometry, a reflection of the cosmic order. They claimed that the flood was not only physical but spiritual, a drowning of man's higher nature beneath the waters of ignorance. In their temples, they drew concentric circles on the floors, walked them in silence, and said, "We return to Atlantis each time we remember harmony." Then came the historians, men of reason and ink. They studied Plato's words like scripture, counting syllables, measuring distances. They mapped his descriptions onto the world, an island beyond the straits, larger than Libya and Asia combined. Some pointed to the Azores, others to the Canary Islands, others still to the Caribbean, where coral reefs gleamed like drowned marble beneath the waves. Every discovery, every anomaly, every shard of pottery beneath the sea was hailed as the proof the world awaited. Yet none endured. The ocean, patient and merciless, yielded only fragments, enough to provoke belief, never enough to satisfy it. Still, the search did not end. It deepened. In the libraries of Alexandria, scholars compiled maps of the known and unknown world, seeking patterns in the ocean's shape. In Rome, sailors whispered of ruins glimpsed through clear waters off distant coasts. In the deserts of Arabia, caravans told of traders who had found seashells high upon the mountains, relics of a world drowned long before their own. Everywhere the same realization returned. The earth itself carried the memory of the flood. And so the legend spread beyond philosophy. It entered religion, poetry, and prophecy. Early Christian mystics spoke of Atlantis as the first Eden, destroyed not by God's wrath but by man's forgetting. Jewish sages saw in it a reflection of Babel, the tower which tried to pierce heaven. The Islamic scholars of Andalusia wrote of a kingdom of the West that vanished beneath the sea after defying the will of the Almighty, Iram of the Pillars, they called it. In every tongue, in every era, Atlantis was reborn with new names and new meanings, yet always the same ache, the longing to recover what was lost. By the age of discovery, the myth had become map. Sailors venturing beyond the pillars of Heracles carried Plato's words like compass and prayer. They called the uncharted waters the Sea of Darkness, believing that somewhere beyond it lay either the edge of the world or the gates of paradise. Christopher Columbus himself carried with him a copy of the Timaeus, and when he found the New World, he wrote of islands so lush and golden that he wondered if he had stumbled upon the edge of Atlantis's remains. But the sea gives little and takes much. Each expedition that sought to chart its secrets returned either broken or bewitched. Storms rose from calm horizons, compasses failed, Sailors saw lights dancing beneath the waves. The more the world searched, the more the ocean seemed to draw its veil tighter. Some whispered that the gods had hidden Atlantis deliberately, not to punish man, but to protect him from his own desire to rebuild it. Yet still the search continued, because to abandon it was to abandon a part of the human soul. For Atlantis was never just a city, it was the memory of perfection, the image of a time when mankind lived in balance with the divine. To search for it was to confess that the heart remembers paradise and cannot be content until it finds it again. Through centuries, the seekers changed, from philosophers to explorers, from mystics to scientists, but their longing remained the same. They were all drawn by the same echo, that low and ancient hum rising from the sea, whispering in every tide, "Come and remember." And in that whisper lay both hope and danger, for to find Atlantis would be to face the truth it was built to teach, that the heights of knowledge and the depths of pride are separated only by a single wave. As centuries rolled into ages, the world grew older, but the ocean remained the same. Empires rose upon its shores, Rome, Byzantium, the caliphates, the kingdoms of the north, each gazing upon the waters with awe and unease, sensing in their depths a secret too vast for comprehension. The story of Atlantis lived quietly within their myths, like a candle hidden in the folds of time, flickering but never extinguished. Every culture that touched the sea inherited its whisper, reshaping it to its own reflection. The scholars of Alexandria had long ago perished in fire, but their dream endured. In distant monasteries of Europe, monks copied Plato's Timaeus and Critias by hand, the ink black as the ocean at night. Some believed the tale to be allegory, a mirror of the soul; others, a history too ancient to fit within the New World's timeline. To the theologians, Atlantis became a riddle of divine justice, the story of an Eden corrupted not by disobedience, but by excess. When man makes himself God, they wrote, he invites the sea to become his judge. During the Renaissance, curiosity awoke again. Artists painted visions of the lost city, domes of glass rising from blue abysses, marble halls filled with light that rippled like water. Alchemists spoke of the Atlantean fire, a mythical energy that could transmute the base into the divine. Poets described the sea as a veil between worlds, and those who sailed beyond the horizon as pilgrims seeking not land, but memory. The age of exploration had begun, and with it, the myth stirred anew not as metaphor, but as possibility. It was in this age that the mapmakers began to listen to the whispers of sailors, the strange accounts brought from distant waters. They spoke of stone formations beneath the waves near the Azores, of colossal walls glimpsed through clear Caribbean shallows, of lights that shimmered like torch glow under the surface at night. Some dismissed these tales as hallucinations born of fatigue and salt. Others saw in them the glimmer of truth. The Portuguese chroniclers wrote of a hidden continent of the West, the Spanish of Antillia. The cartographers of the early modern age began to fill their maps with symbols, islands drawn not from sight, but from longing. In time, that longing hardened into pursuit. Philosophers turned explorers, explorers turned prophets. The French mystic Louis de Leon declared that Atlantis lay not in the sea, but in the memory of every soul. The English scholar Francis Bacon envisioned the new Atlantis, an island where science, guided by divine wisdom, restored the harmony once lost to pride. He did not claim to have found it, but to have reimagined it, a rebirth through knowledge rather than conquest. The dream had shifted. Atlantis was no longer only behind mankind, it was also ahead. And yet the sea refused to yield. The centuries marched on, and though men circled the globe, the heart of the Atlantic remained vast and indifferent. Expeditions came and went, their ships swallowed by storms that seemed to rise from nowhere. Some explorers returned claiming they had felt a magnetic pull in certain waters, as though drawn toward something sleeping below. Others spoke of instruments gone mad, compasses spinning without reason, time itself bending as they passed through regions where the air shimmered with strange heat. When the world turned to science in the Age of Reason, the legend should have faded, yet it only deepened. For even in the Age of Instruments, the ocean remained a mystery. The philosophers who rejected myth began to dream again, though now they cloaked it in geology and exploration. They spoke of cataclysmic earthquakes, of continents that could sink and rise, of ice that could melt and swallow worlds. The myth of Atlantis found its reflection in the language of science, the shifting crusts, the wandering poles, the forgotten epochs beneath the sea. Still, something about the legend resisted being reduced to theory. It had a pulse, a haunting presence that outlived logic. For no matter how many maps were drawn or how many theories proposed, every generation produced new seekers. Some searched the sea, others searched the mind. The poet Shelley wrote of the sunken isles of memory, and the German philosopher Schelling declared that Atlantis was not history, but archetype, a memory embedded in the collective human soul, the story we tell to remember that perfection once walked among us. By the 19th century, as technology advanced and the world shrank beneath man's curiosity, the search became fevered. Submarines, diving bells, and oceanographic instruments allowed explorers to peer into the abyss. In 1882, Ignatius Donnelly published Atlantis, the antediluvian world, claiming with confidence that the lost continent had once connected the old and new worlds, the cradle of all civilization. His words ignited the world. For the first time, myth felt close to proof. From that moment, the search ceased to be a pastime of philosophers and became a pursuit of nations. Expeditions set out across the Atlantic, scanning the seabed, dredging the depths. Every ridge, every plateau, every strange anomaly was measured and claimed. When they discovered the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a great spine of volcanic mountains stretching beneath the ocean, some declared it the backbone of the lost land itself. Atlantis, they said, is rising again. But the sea smiled in silence. It gave only hints, only echoes, as it always had. The maps multiplied, the arguments deepened, but Atlantis remained hidden. It was as if the ocean, in its infinite wisdom, understood that the myth's power lay not in its discovery, but in its pursuit. For as long as humanity searched, it would keep alive the memory of harmony, of humility, of the truth that even the greatest light can fall beneath the waves, and that from the fall comes remembrance. So the search continues in sonar and dream, in satellite and story. Scientists scan the seabed, mystics read the stars, and beneath them both, the same pulse endures, the heartbeat of the drowned city, echoing softly through the deep, whispering, "You have not lost us. You have only forgotten where to listen." By the 20th century, the name Atlantis had ceased to be only legend. It had become an obsession. The modern age, with its hunger for proof and its worship of knowledge, could not resist the challenge of the sea's oldest secret. Men who once measured the heavens now turned their instruments toward the abyss, seeking to map the uncharted depths where myth might hide. The old dream that had haunted prophets and poets now called to scientists, divers, and dreamers alike. The first expeditions sailed not as pilgrims, but as engineers. They carried sonar, cameras, and lights that pierced the black belly of the ocean. In the 1940s and 50s, explorers began to speak of strange anomalies on the seafloor, stone-like formations too symmetrical to be natural, plateaus that resembled walls and steps. In the 1960s, off the coast of Bimini, divers discovered a series of massive limestone blocks stretching into the sea. They called it the Bimini Road. To some, it was proof, the road to the lost city itself. To others, only the work of tides and time. But the sea, as ever, gave no answer. It merely watched. Around the same time, the philosopher Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, claimed in trance that Atlantis would rise again near Bimini before the century's end. His followers scoured the ocean floor for signs of the awakening. None came, and yet the legend deepened, because perhaps what was to rise was not stone, but memory. In the age of satellites, humanity's gaze turned higher even as it reached deeper. Cameras mapped the ocean floor from orbit, tracing mountain ranges beneath the waves. There, hidden beneath miles of pressure and shadow, scientists found evidence of vanished landmasses, fragments of plateaus, scars of ancient rivers now drowned. The geologists called them microcontinents, relics of the Earth's shifting skin. The dreamers called them Atlantis. For a brief moment, science and myth seemed to meet, and then, as always, they parted again. The seabed told stories, yes, but not of a single sunken kingdom. It spoke instead of cycles, of continents that rose and fell over eons, of floods that had remade the world long before men carved their first cities. And in that revelation, the myth of Atlantis began to change once more. It ceased to be a lost island and became a symbol of memory itself, the ghost of every civilization swallowed by time. In the deserts of Africa, explorers unearthed the ruins of ancient cities long buried beneath sand, echoes of empires forgotten by history. In the jungles of South America, temples swallowed by roots whispered of cultures erased by their own gods. The archaeologists who stood among those ruins began to wonder if Atlantis was not one place, but all of them, a name for the endless pattern of rise and fall that defines humanity. The ocean was merely the deepest mirror of that truth. And yet the pull remained. In 2009, a set of satellite images appeared online showing grid-like patterns beneath the Atlantic near the Canary Islands. The world erupted in excitement. The streets of Atlantis, headlines cried. Within days, scientists explained them away as digital artifacts, errors in sonar mapping, but the hope had already escaped into the public imagination. The myth breathed again, proving that it needed no ruins to live, only belief. Even now, in this age of deep-sea drones and data, men still dive for Atlantis. They descend into the abyss not merely for discovery, but for something older, something sacred. Each new explorer, standing before the black waters, feels the same question tremble inside him. What if the sea still remembers? What if the dream was true? Perhaps it is not the city they seek, but the echo within themselves, that ancient knowing that once, long ago, mankind lived in harmony with creation and lost it. The longing for Atlantis is the longing for balance, for innocence, for the divine reflection that still sleeps beneath the waves. The philosophers knew it, the mystics felt it. The scientists, even as they deny it, chase it through equations and pressure gauges, hoping the instruments might one day translate the song of the deep. Sometimes, in the stillness between waves, the ocean seems almost to answer, not with discovery, but with understanding. It murmurs through the currents, through the hum of the sonar, through the pulse of the human heart itself. You cannot find what was never lost. Atlantis is in you. And perhaps that is why the search will never end, because it was never meant to. It is humanity's mirror, the divine reminder that every flood, every fall, every failure carries within it the promise of rebirth. The sea keeps the secret only so that man will keep seeking it, for in seeking, he remembers who he once was, a child of the deep, a dreamer of light, a wanderer between worlds. And in the hush between two tides, when the sky and the sea are the same color and the wind holds its breath, it almost feels as if the lost city stirs, not beneath the water, but within the soul that still dares to listen. The ocean has no archives, yet it remembers more faithfully than stone. Beneath its endless weight lies not merely sediment and silence, but memory, the soft record of everything the world has ever been. Each layer of silt is a page, each fossil a letter, each current a whisper repeating what the earth once knew. And now, in the modern age, humanity has learned to listen, not with priests or prophets, but with machines. The quest for Atlantis, which began as myth and transformed into philosophy, has entered its final incarnation, the search for memory itself. The scientists who map the deep no longer speak of gods or golden temples. They speak of data, of bathymetric scans, seismic lines, and thermal vents. But in truth, they are doing what the ancient priests once did. They are listening for the voice of the sea. Every echo that returns from the abyss is a syllable of an ancient language, one written not in words but in waves. Their instruments cast sound into darkness and wait for memory to answer. And sometimes it does. From those echoes, they have built a new scripture, the science of the Earth's remembrance. The ocean floor, once invisible, now reveals the bones of forgotten ages. There are mountain ranges beneath the waves larger than any upon land, trenches deeper than any cathedral spire, plains that stretch for 1,000 miles beneath the surface. Through these discoveries, the scientists have begun to piece together the planet's secret history, a world that has been born and drowned many times before. They tell us that the Earth is restless, that the continents drift like sleepers in a dream. What we call oceans today were once fields and forests. What we call deserts were once seas. Every few millennia, the balance shifts. Ice rises and melts, mountains split and fall. The memory of Atlantis may not lie in one place, but in this rhythm itself, the eternal breathing of the earth, inhaling creation and exhaling destruction. And yet, as the machines send their signals into the deep, they sometimes find shapes that defy explanation. Perfect right angles carved into volcanic rock, ridges aligned like avenues, circular depressions that mirror celestial maps. The scientists call them coincidences of geology, but the poets within them, for every true scientist carries a hidden poet, look upon those images and feel something older stirring. The same wonder that drove Plato to write, the same awe that drew Solon to listen to the priests of sighs. For even in the age of analysis, mystery endures. There are places on this earth where the sea seems too deliberate, too ordered to be merely chance. Off the coast of Cuba, sonar images show massive rectangular structures buried beneath the sand, as if a city once stood there, its columns now shadows in the deep. Near Yonaguni in Japan, divers have found vast terraces and steps cut into stone, eerily precise, an architecture older than history. Scientists argue erosion, tectonics, illusion. But those who descend into that blue silence often emerge changed. It feels alive, one diver said, as though the sea itself were waiting for someone to remember its name. Memory, after all, is not confined to the mind. The earth remembers through its movements, the air through its currents, and the ocean through its salt. Each grain of sand that drifts upon the tide carries the imprint of every shore it has touched. When a scientist lifts a sample from the seabed, they hold in their hand the condensed memory of 1,000,000 years. The instruments may call it sediment, but in truth it is scripture. In laboratories across the world, researchers study isotopes and microfossils, tracing the lines of the past. They speak of the Younger Dryas, that mysterious cold snap that followed the last great melting of the Ice Age. Around 12,000 years ago, the Earth shifted violently, glaciers collapsed, the seas surged upward by hundreds of feet. Civilizations, if any had flourished then, would have vanished beneath the flood. It is here that myth and measurement converge. Plato's timeline, the scientists admit, is not impossible. The world could indeed have drowned a great kingdom in that age of chaos. The story of Atlantis may not be fantasy, but the fragmented memory of that planetary grief. Yet the more we learn, the more the mystery deepens. The machines can show us the shape of the seafloor, but not the soul of what lies beneath. Sonar cannot measure longing. Satellites cannot capture the pulse of myth. The instruments return data, and still the ocean keeps its secret. It reminds us that knowledge without reverence is only noise. For the sea, in its infinite patience, does not reveal itself to those who seek conquest. It speaks only to those who listen. Perhaps this is the true science of memory, not the study of what the world once was, but the art of remembering with humility. To understand that every map is temporary, every discovery a reflection of the moment, and that beneath our equations lies the same yearning that moved the ancients to prayer. For the ocean is not a mystery to be solved, but a teacher to be remembered. And when the deep calls back its sound, when the echoes rise from the dark trenches to touch our machines, it is as if the sea is whispering once more, "You have measured my depths, but not yet your own." For in every search for Atlantis, whether through telescope, sonar, or dream, what humanity truly seeks is not a lost city, but a forgotten harmony, the balance between knowledge and wonder, reason and reverence, science and soul. The Atlanteans once broke that balance. The flood was their forgetting. Our search for them, perhaps, is our way of remembering. And so the machines keep listening, and the sea keeps whispering. Somewhere in the dark between them, memory becomes prophecy again, the eternal reminder that the world does not lose what it loves. It only hides it until we are ready to see. In the laboratories where the ocean's secrets are studied, the air hums with machines. The hum is steady, precise, and almost reverent, a hymn of circuitry replacing the chants that once rose in the marble halls of ancient temples. Scientists move between monitors and maps, their faces bathed in blue light as they listen to the echoes of the deep. On the screens, the seafloor stretches out in spectral lines and shadowed plains, continents drowned, mountains inverted, rivers fossilized into silence. The data streams endlessly, and yet behind every number is a question that no instrument can answer. Why does the earth remember? The ancients would have said that memory itself is divine, that the world keeps its recollections because it is alive. The modern mind calls it geology, but the essence is the same. Every element on this planet has witnessed something and refused to forget it. In the veins of stone, the ocean's weight has pressed the history of stars. In the salt, the tears of vanished storms still linger. And perhaps in the deep sea currents that flow like arteries around the globe, there is a consciousness older than mankind, not thought, but rhythm, an intelligence that does not speak but simply is. To study the sea is to stare into eternity, and eternity changes those who dare to measure it. The divers who descend into the abyss return pale and wide-eyed, their voices lowered as though they had trespassed into a cathedral. Down there, one said, you feel time pressing on you, you see the world as it was before the first light touched it. Some describe a sensation of familiarity, as if the body, in the presence of the ocean's depths, recalls what it was made from. For every drop of blood, every tear, every cell carries the chemistry of the sea. We are, in essence, its children who learn to walk upon its forgotten shores. The scientists call their instruments memory machines. They send out pulses of sound, small, controlled earthquakes, and listen for their return. The echoes bounce off hidden ridges and sunken plains, translating pressure into image. But what they find most often is silence, vast stretches of nothing blacker than thought. The data shows absence, but the absence hums. The ocean, they say, resists translation. It yields knowledge only as illusion, always keeping something sacred beneath its surface. Sometimes the technology betrays wonder. A sonar scan might show the ghostly outline of a perfect circle beneath a mile of water, or a stairway of terraces cut into stone. Satellites might detect magnetic fields where no land should be, as though something metallic still breathes below. But when researchers return, guided by coordinates and curiosity, they find only mud and darkness. It is as if the sea withdraws its revelations the moment one seeks to touch them, the way a dream fades when spoken aloud. There are those among the scientists, quiet, careful men and women, who confess in private that the sea behaves like a mind. It remembers where we look, said one oceanographer. It watches us. They laugh as they say it, but their laughter is soft, uncertain. They know that for all our satellites and submersibles, the ocean remains mostly unseen, a mystery greater than the cosmos. Humanity has mapped more of the surface of Mars than of its own abyss. Perhaps the gods hid themselves there for that very reason, to dwell within the one place we can never wholly conquer. And yet the deeper we probe, the more we rediscover ourselves. The patterns that emerge in the sediment, spirals, ratios, alignments, are the same patterns found in ancient architecture, in the design of the human ear in the whirl of galaxies. The universe, it seems, repeats its geometry everywhere, as if to remind us that creation is not chaos, but music. The Atlanteans once understood this. Their temples were tuned to the resonance of the earth, their altars aligned to the hum of the planets. We too have begun to hear it again, through mathematics instead of prayer, through physics instead of faith. Yet the melody is the same. This is the new language of remembrance. Frequency, vibration, wave, words that sound mechanical but are in truth spiritual. For sound, light, and memory are one substance expressed in different forms. A word spoken into air becomes vibration. A vibration leaves an imprint. An imprint becomes history. Thus, even when no one remembers Atlantis, The sound of its name endures in the sea's rhythm, the pulse that beats in every tide. The philosophers of the modern age, listening to these revelations, have begun to whisper what the mystics knew all along, that perhaps consciousness itself is the ocean's oldest creation, that memory, not matter, is the foundation of existence. The sea does not forget because it is the world's mind, dreaming in blue. And when we send our machines to map its floor, what we are really doing is tracing the lines of its thought, the reflections of our own beginnings, mirrored back to us through salt and sound. Perhaps Atlantis was not only a city, but an idea, the memory of humanity's first conversation with the divine. When the sea took it back, it was not an act of vengeance, but of protection. The ocean has guarded that knowledge for 12,000 years, keeping it safe until the world grows humble enough to listen again. Every expedition, every sonar scan, every drop of water pulled from the deep brings us closer to that threshold, to the moment when we will remember not only where we came from, but why we were made. Until then, the sea hums quietly, repeating to those who can still hear, all that you seek lies beneath your own forgetting. Before a city is built in stone, it is imagined in silence. Every civilization begins as a dream, a vision that first rises not from the earth, but from the soul. Atlantis, too, was such a dream before it became a city, and even after the sea swallowed it, the dream endured. It moved inward. The kingdom that had once ruled the oceans retreated into the heart of mankind, becoming an inner realm, a landscape of spirit rather than soil, of memory rather than marble. For when the sea closed above Atlantis, it did not end its people. It baptized them. The Atlantean spirit, purified by loss, was scattered among the generations that followed, carried in their myths, their instincts, their yearning for the divine. It is said that within every human heart there remains an island, luminous, submerged, waiting to rise. To find Atlantis now is to descend not into the ocean, but into oneself. The ancients understood this, though they spoke in symbols. The philosophers of Greece called it the anima mundi, the soul of the world, of which every human is a reflection. The Sufis named it the hidden kingdom, the place within where the light of God still burns though the outer world forgets it. The mystics of Kemet taught that Thoth had hidden the wisdom of Atlantis not in the sea, but within man's own consciousness. For there, he said, it shall never be lost. And perhaps this is why the legend never faded. The story of Atlantis is more than history. It is a parable of the human condition. We rise toward the divine, we forget, we fall, and in falling we awaken again. The city beneath the waves is the reflection of that cycle, the reminder that every flood without is born from a drought within. Pride, not the sea, was the first tide that drowned Atlantis. And pride still is what keeps the memory of harmony submerged in the human soul. But if pride drowned the city, humility can raise it again. The rediscovery of Atlantis begins not with maps or machines, but with silence, the same silence from which it was first imagined. To descend into that silence is to follow the sound of water within, the heartbeat, the breath, the pulse of life that has never ceased echoing the rhythm of the sea. For within the body, we carry its echo, salt in our blood, tide in our veins, the moon still stirring the waters of our sleep. We are the ocean, remembering itself. The seekers of old intuited this. When the temples fell, the wise men did not rebuild them in stone, they built them in ritual. They turned architecture into meditation, geography into prayer. The kingdom of heaven is within you, said the prophets of later ages, and though the phrase came from new tongues, the truth was ancient. Atlantis was never lost, only internalized. Even the sciences, which once seemed to exile the sacred, have begun to circle back toward mystery. The physicists who stare into the quantum depths speak of consciousness shaping reality, of observation creating form. The neuroscientists who chart the brain's waves describe thought in terms of frequency, vibration, resonance, the same language that once defined the sacred geometry of Atlantis. As the ancients once mapped the stars to understand the soul, so the modern mind maps neurons and discovers constellations there. The cosmos, it seems, has not vanished from us, it has moved inward, and our skulls have become its vault. If one listens long enough in stillness, one can feel it, that quiet city inside, shining faintly beneath the waters of thought. Its avenues are made of memory, its towers of intuition. Its light is not seen but felt, a pulse of knowing that speaks without words. It is the place we glimpse in dreams, the one that feels more real than waking. Sometimes it appears as a landscape, sometimes as a song, sometimes as a moment of absolute peace when the self dissolves and all that remains is vastness. That is the inner Atlantis, the kingdom that cannot be drowned because it was never made of stone. The mystics say that to rebuild the outer world, one must first restore the inner. The flood that ended the first Atlantis was a cleansing, not a punishment, the divine reminder that no kingdom can survive when it forgets the balance between earth and heaven, body and soul. The modern world, for all its light and noise, stands at a similar edge. Our towers reach high, our machines hum deep, yet in our hearts, the old silence calls again. The waters are stirring, not in wrath, but in warning. The rediscovery of Atlantis is not a matter of discovery, but of remembrance. It is a turning inward, a recognition that the paradise we lost is the harmony we abandoned within ourselves. The ancients carved this truth into stone because they knew we would forget it. They wrote it in myth so that even when their words were gone, the story would whisper through time. As above, so below, they said, and also, as within, so without. For when the soul remembers its own depth, the sea becomes calm, the storms cease, the waters recede, revealing again the city that was never truly lost, the kingdom within the heart that still glows with divine fire. And in that stillness, the seeker finds not ruins, but reflection. The gates of Atlantis are the eyes that look inward. The temple is the mind made quiet. The treasure is understanding. Perhaps that is what the sea has been trying to tell us all along, that it never took Atlantis from us. It only hid it where it could not be destroyed. And when humanity is ready, when its pride has softened into wonder, the waters will part once more, not to reveal a city of marble, but a light within every soul, shining with the same radiance that once crowned the world. And the voice of the ocean, eternal and kind, will say, "Welcome home." There are no endings in the language of the ocean, only tides that return. What sinks today will rise tomorrow, and what is lost beneath the waves is never truly gone, only waiting to be remembered. The sea has no past tense. It moves in circles, just as time itself does, carrying within it the stories of the world. And among those stories, none is as complete, as patient, or as merciful as the one called Atlantis. The world has turned many times since that night of thunder and light, when the island of the gods sank beneath the deep. Empires have risen, fallen, and turned to dust. The names of kings have faded from stone, yet the sea remains, the same deep pulse, the same endless mirror. It has washed the shores of every age, carrying the fragments of one into the birth of another. The ocean remembers because it must. It is the memory of the earth itself, the heart that never sleeps. Those who walk beside it feel it instinctively. The sound of waves against the shore is not only water on stone, it is the sound of time speaking. It is the murmur of every civilization that has come and gone, returning again as rhythm. When we stand at the edge of the sea and look into its immensity, what we truly see is not distance, but reflection. The ocean is the oldest mirror, and when we gaze upon it, we glimpse our own beginning. For the story of Atlantis was never about the fall of one city, but about the memory of all creation. It is the parable of how beauty forgets its source, how power without reverence summons the tide, and how loss becomes the teacher that restores balance. The sea did not destroy Atlantis out of cruelty. It returned it to the origin, to the womb of silence where all things are remade. The flood was not punishment, it was purification. And so the ocean endures, vast, watchful, benevolent in its sorrow. It is both destroyer and healer, erasing with one hand and remembering with the other. Every wave that crashes on the shore is a fragment of that first flood, a heartbeat of Poseidon still echoing through the ages. It reminds us that nothing, not even ruin, is final. The sea swallows, but it also gives back in coral, in shell, in song, in dream. The poets have always known this. They write of the ocean as eternity made visible, of the deep as the soul of God. Between the water and the stars, said one, lies the memory of everything. The mystics listen to its pulse and call it the sound of divine breathing. The scientists, peering into its depths, measure its currents and discover in them the same mathematics that governs galaxies. The ocean, it seems, is the bridge between the finite and the infinite, the whisper of the divine translated into matter. When Atlantis fell, it was not erased, it was transformed into this eternal rhythm. Every wave that touches the shore is a syllable of its name. Every rain that falls carries its memory back to the world above. The sea has woven its story into the weather, into the tides, into the salt of our blood. We live surrounded by its remembrance, sustained by it. And when we sleep, when our breathing slows to the rhythm of waves, it is the ocean's lullaby that carries us into dreams, the same song that once rose through the shining halls of the drowned city. There are moments in the stillness before dawn when the veil thins. The horizon becomes a single line between worlds, the seen and the unseen, the past and the eternal. In that moment, if one listens, the sea speaks, not in words but in feeling, the quiet knowing that everything we build, everything we love, will one day return to the source, and that such return is not loss, but fulfillment. The tide is not a thief, it is a promise. Perhaps that is what the ancients meant when they said that the gods live in the sea, not in marble temples, not in thunder or flame, but in the endless rhythm of creation itself, the giving, the taking, the returning. The ocean teaches what no scripture can, that immortality is not defiance of change, but surrender to it, that eternity is not an unbroken stillness, but the harmony of rise and fall, breath and silence, light and shadow. The story of Atlantis ends, as all sacred stories do, where it began, in the heart of the sea. The city that once defied the heavens now rests within them, dissolved but not destroyed, its essence diffused through every wave and every living thing. Its legacy is not found in ruins, but in remembrance. We see it when sunlight turns the ocean to gold. We hear it in the wind that moves across the water. We feel it in the longing that awakens when we stand at the shore, gazing toward the horizon, sensing that something ancient is calling us home. And maybe that call has never ceased, for the ocean is not only the grave of Atlantis, it is its voice. It speaks through us now, through every artist, every seeker, every dreamer who looks beyond the surface and asks, what if the lost world was never lost at all? It was said that when the last of Atlantis sank beneath the waves, Poseidon placed a single pearl at the bottom of the sea, a seed of light, waiting for mankind to grow wise enough to find it again. That pearl is not a city. It is a state of being, the remembrance that we and the ocean are one, that what we drown in despair, we will find again in grace. The sea is eternal, and through it so are we. For as long as waves rise and fall, as long as the wind carries salt, Atlantis lives not as ruin or relic, but as rhythm. And when the final tide comes, when time itself folds into silence, it will not be an ending. It will be the sea's soft whisper, returning everything to the beginning. Come home, my children, the waters remember you. And so the waves continue, carrying the story onward, infinite, luminous, eternal.